I have exactly $2,000 left to my name, a failing heart, and a flight back to Chicago I will never be able to afford. Which means I am going to die here, in this 10 square meter room, listening to stray dogs fight outside a window that doesn't close properly. If you had looked at my resume 3 years ago, you wouldn't understand how I ended up in a periphery neighborhood in Rio de Janeiro, with peeling paint falling on my bed. For 40 years, I was a structural engineer. I managed multi-million-dollar commercial projects. I built steel frameworks designed to withstand the worst elements. My entire career was based on analyzing stress points, calculating risks, and seeing the invisible cracks long before a foundation could fail. I was a man of logic, precision, and control. But logic doesn't protect you from silence. I didn't lose $290,000 because my mind was slipping. I didn't wire away my life savings because I fell for some crude internet scam. I lost everything because I was 71 years old, my wife of 35 years was dead, and the quiet in my house had become unbearable. I was a man who had spent his entire adult life being the provider, the protector, the one everyone relied on, and suddenly nobody needed my advice. Nobody needed me at all. I was completely, suffocatingly irrelevant. People look at a ruined old man and assume he was foolish. What they don't understand is how easily a smart man can justify his own destruction when he is starving to feel alive again. I am not telling you this to ask for your sympathy. I don't deserve it, and frankly, I don't want it. The shame I feel is absolute. I haven't even been able to bring myself to call my own daughter to tell her what I've done. I am telling you this because I remember the exact moment the trap was set, and I remember walking into it voluntarily, entirely convinced that I was the one pulling the strings. I thought I was engineering my way out of an empty life. I had no idea I was just building my own tomb. You have to understand the kind of man I was. In structural engineering, there is no room for optimism. You don't hope a steel beam will support 300 tons of concrete. You calculate the exact load-bearing capacity. You factor in wind shear, thermal expansion, the inevitable shifting of the earth beneath the foundation. For 4 decades in Chicago, my signature was the final word on commercial high-rises. If I miscalculated, structures would fail, but I didn't miscalculate. My entire existence was an exercise in identifying weaknesses and reinforcing them before they could break. I was a man who lived strictly by the numbers. That same rigorous control governed my personal life. I was married to Eleanor for 35 years. I was the provider. I paid off our mortgage 5 years ahead of schedule. I funded our daughter's college education in full. Whenever something broke, whether it was the furnace in the basement or a complex insurance claim, I was the one who fixed it. I was the center of gravity in my family. People relied on my competence, and I drew my entire identity from that weight. But then cancer took Eleanor. It was the one variable I couldn't engineer my way out of. After she died, the house in Chicago stopped being a home. It became just a perfectly maintained, highly efficient empty space. My daughter had built her own life out in Seattle. We had slowly drifted into that polite, scheduled Sunday afternoon phone call kind of relationship. I don't blame her. I was always a practical father, not a particularly warm one. My love was expressed through providing, and suddenly there was no one left to provide for. My usefulness had expired. The silence in that house started to feel like a physical pressure. I had $350,000 in liquid savings, a steady Social Security check, and absolutely no reason to get out of bed in the morning. So, I made a plan. I treated my own retirement like a late-stage project. I built spreadsheets analyzing global exchange rates, healthcare infrastructure, and cost of living indexes. Relocating to Rio de Janeiro made mathematical sense. I sold the house to escape the brutal winters that only reminded me of Eleanor's final months. The strategy was airtight. I would rent a modest, secure apartment near Copacabana, integrate slowly into the local routine, and spend my final years reading, walking the promenade, and enjoying a quiet, solitary, tropical retirement. I felt completely in control. I looked at the other older American expats, the loud, lonely men lingering in tourist bars, desperately trying to buy the attention of young women, and I felt nothing but a quiet, clinical pity. I wasn't like them. I wasn't looking for a messy, embarrassing second youth. I was too smart, too grounded, too disciplined to fall into the crude clichés of an old man with money in a foreign country. I thought being rational meant I was safe. I thought my intelligence was an impenetrable shield. But what I didn't put into my carefully constructed spreadsheets was the simple, undeniable fact that I hadn't felt the warmth of another human touch in 3 years. I didn't calculate the corrosive, hollow ache of walking through a vibrant, crowded city every day, knowing with absolute certainty that if my heart stopped beating in my sleep, it would take a week for anyone back home to even notice I was gone. I remember the last week in the Chicago house. I had sold most of the furniture, keeping only the bare essentials until the closing date. Without the rugs and the bookshelves, every footstep echoed. I would sit at the kitchen island with my laptop, drinking black coffee, listening to the low hum of the refrigerator. That hum was the only conversation I had most days. My daughter had flown in to help me pack the living room a month earlier, but she had her own life in Seattle, a husband, a toddler, a demanding career. We hugged at the airport, she told me to enjoy my adventure, and I went back to a house that no longer felt like mine. It was during those silent, sterile mornings that I finalized the parameters of my escape. I approached my relocation exactly how I would approach a commercial build. I needed a location with a favorable exchange rate, a robust private healthcare infrastructure, and a climate that wouldn't trap me indoors for 6 months of the year to brood over Eleanor's absence. I built the spreadsheets. I ran the numbers on Lisbon, Medellin, Panama City, and Rio de Janeiro. Rio won on the math. The currency conversion meant my monthly Social Security check alone would cover a very comfortable lifestyle, allowing my $350,000 in savings to remain virtually untouched, gathering interest. It was a perfect, frictionless plan. I packed 2 suitcases, boarded a plane, and left the gray winters behind. When I first arrived in Brazil, I executed the strategy flawlessly. I avoided the messy tourist traps. I rented a modest, highly secure one-bedroom apartment 2 blocks back from the beach in Copacabana. It had a 24-hour doorman, thick plaster walls, and a small balcony that caught the morning sun. I established a rigorous routine. I woke up at 6, walked 2 miles along the Mosaic Promenade, bought an international paper at a local newsstand, and drank a black coffee at the same corner bakery. In the afternoons, I read historical biographies. In the evenings, I cooked simple, healthy meals for myself. For the first few months, I felt a quiet, smug satisfaction. The math was working. I would occasionally see the other older American expats, the ones sitting at the beachfront kiosks at 2 in the afternoon, sweating through their shirts, buying overpriced beers for girls 50 years their junior. I looked at them with clinical disgust. They were structural failures waiting to happen, men led by their lowest impulses. They had come here looking for a messy fantasy. I wasn't like them. I had come here to execute a beautifully engineered holding pattern. But a holding pattern is still just circling in the empty air, waiting for the fuel to run out. What the spreadsheets didn't account for was the sheer volume of time I suddenly had to fill, and the agonizing lack of friction in my new life. When you spend 40 years solving complex, high-stakes problems, a life without demands feels like a vacuum. No one called to ask my opinion on a load-bearing wall. No one needed me to fix a broken furnace or navigate a complicated insurance claim. I was perfectly safe, perfectly comfortable, and completely invisible. I would sit on my balcony in the evenings, listening to the sounds of families in the apartments below me, the muffled laughter, the clinking of silverware, the passionate arguments. Life was happening just on the other side of the concrete, and I was entirely locked out of it. I had engineered a flawless existence where absolutely nothing was required of me. And slowly, day by day, that absolute safety began to feel indistinguishable from being buried alive. I had been in Rio for 6 months when the variable I couldn't calculate walked into a quiet, upscale bakery in the South Zone. It wasn't a dimly lit tourist bar. It wasn't one of those dating apps designed to separate lonely old men from their dignity. It was a Tuesday morning, raining slightly, at a place that charged too much for espresso and played soft jazz. She was standing at the counter ahead of me. Camilla, 36 years old. She wasn't dressed to turn heads. She was wearing dark slacks, a simple conservative blouse, and a hospital ID badge clipped to her pocket. She looked entirely exhausted. She was shifting the weight of a heavy nursing textbook while paying for her coffee. She grabbed her cup, walked out, and left a small, worn, leather wallet sitting next to the register. I picked it up, stepped out into the humid morning, and caught up to her under the awning. When I handed it back, she didn't bat her eyelashes. She didn't put on a performance. She just exhaled a breath she seemed to have been holding for years, closed her eyes for a second, and thanked me in perfect, articulate English. I offered to buy her a fresh coffee, maybe sit down for 10 minutes to chat. The standard play. But she looked at her watch and shook her head. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice genuinely strained. "I have a double shift at the hospital in 30 minutes, and I still have to study." She then insisted on buying me an espresso instead to say thank you. She pulled a crumpled bill from the wallet I had just returned, handed it to the barista, and walked away. That refusal, that one simple act of denying my money and prioritizing her work, that was the masterstroke. In an instant, my brain categorized her. She wasn't one of the girls prowling the beachfront looking for an American sponsor. She was an honorable, hard-working woman fighting for her future. She was fiercely independent. And most dangerously of all, she didn't need me. Or so I thought. We bumped into each other a week later at the same bakery. This time, she had 20 minutes. Over the next 3 months, we built a connection. It was agonizingly slow, which is exactly why it felt so impenetrable. There were no grand, sweeping declarations of romance. There were just afternoon walks along the promenade. There were quiet evenings in my rented apartment where she would bring fresh ingredients, absolutely refusing to let me pay for them, and cook traditional Brazilian meals while humming to herself in my kitchen. She introduced me to her aunt, a warm, older woman who served us coffee in a modest house far away from the polished tourist zones. I was brought into the fold. I wasn't an ATM. I was a respected guest. I was participating in real life again. And she listened. God, she listened. For 3 years I had been talking to empty rooms. Suddenly, here was this vibrant, intelligent woman sitting on my sofa, pulling her knees to her chest, asking me detailed questions about load-bearing calculations and the logistics of pouring concrete in sub-zero Chicago winters. She didn't just pretend to care. She asked follow-up questions that showed she was tracking the logic. She restored the weight to my voice. She made me feel like an authority again. She made me feel uniquely chosen, not just tolerated for my age. During those long evenings, she shared her own blueprint. It wasn't a fantasy of luxury cars or designer clothes. It was a meticulous, highly practical dream of opening a small, community-based physical therapy clinic. She had the numbers. She knew the municipal zoning laws. She sounded exactly like a young engineer pitching her first major project. I looked at her and saw a rare diamond, a woman of substance who was simply carrying a load too heavy for one person. There were moments, tiny stress fractures in the foundation, that I should have noticed. Sometimes her phone would be turned off for an entire Saturday. Just absolute silence for 24 hours. When she finally resurfaced, she would look completely drained, claiming she had been pulled into an emergency double rotation at the hospital. It made logical sense. It fit the perfect profile of an overworked nursing student. I didn't see the sudden unreachability as a warning sign. I saw it as a structural weakness in her life, a problem waiting to be solved. And I was, above all things, a man who solved problems. The shift happened so gradually, I didn't even feel the foundation settling. It started with a minor stress fracture. We were having dinner at my apartment when she broke down. She didn't ask me for money. That's the genius of it. She just sat at my table, looking completely defeated. and told me the government had temporarily frozen her savings account due to a tax error from her former employer. She was going to miss her nursing school tuition payment. She was going to have to drop out, just one semester shy of finishing. I remember watching her cry. I didn't see a scam. I saw a brilliant, hard-working woman being crushed by a bureaucratic failure. And I was, above all things, a man who fixed failures. I paid the tuition. It was $3,000. I didn't hand her cash. I wired it directly to the account she provided. I rationalized it instantly. I told myself it wasn't a gift. It was an investment in her future. I felt a surge of pride, a hit of that old adrenaline from my working days. I had stepped in. I had solved the problem. I was useful again. But a structural collapse is never just one point of failure. It's a cascading sequence of ignored warnings. There were weekends when her phone would just go dark for 24 hours. Absolute silence. When she finally reappeared on Sunday evening, she would look pale and exhausted, claiming she had been pulled into back-to-back double shifts at the hospital. I accepted the explanation without hesitation. I didn't see the sudden unreachability as a red flag. I saw it as proof of her relentless work ethic. I even felt guilty for wanting more of her time. I was completely blinded by my own ego. I thought I was analyzing the situation logically, but I was just constructing elaborate alibis for the things I didn't want to see. About 4 months in, I was having a rare beer at an expat pub in Ipanema. I mentioned Camilla to a guy I knew vaguely, a retired accountant from Ohio. He looked at me, put his glass down, and told me point blank that nursing students attaching themselves to wealthy older foreigners was a sophisticated, well-known local industry. I didn't just ignore him, I pitied him. I looked at this lonely, bitter man and categorized him as a xenophobic failure who couldn't understand a genuine connection because he had never experienced one. I told myself that his situation was pathetic, but mine was entirely different. I had managed multi-million-dollar construction budgets. I knew how to read people. I was the one pulling the strings. That arrogance is exactly what made me the perfect mark. After the tuition, the boundaries began to dissolve. I was entirely in love with her, mistaking her profound gratitude for romantic devotion. I wanted her to stop working herself into the ground, so I started paying her monthly rent. I told myself I was just relieving her stress so she could focus on her exams. Then, the modest Copacabana apartment wasn't enough anymore. I wanted to give her the life I felt she deserved. We moved out of my sensible one-bedroom and into a luxury rental in Leblon. It was significantly more expensive, but I had $350,000 sitting in a Vanguard account. I was finally spending it on something that made me feel alive. As my financial commitment expanded, my world rapidly contracted. Camilla would subtly mention that my American acquaintances were disrespectful to our relationship, that they looked at her like she was something cheap. It made me furious to think anyone would disrespect her. So, I stopped going to the pub. I stopped attending the expat gatherings. I even stopped answering the scheduled Sunday calls from my daughter in Seattle, telling myself I didn't want to deal with her judgment either. I thought I was protecting the woman I loved from a cynical world. I didn't realize I was just willingly locking the door to my own isolation chamber. The final collapse of a structure rarely happens with a loud explosion. It happens in silence, when the applied load finally exceeds the capacity of the compromised steel. For me, that moment arrived on a Tuesday morning, looking at a real estate listing on my laptop. We had decided to build the clinic. We were also going to leave the rental in Leblon and buy a penthouse. I wanted a permanent foundation for us. But as a foreigner, buying property or registering a business in Brazil is a bureaucratic nightmare. The registry offices, the required tax IDs, the sworn translations, the punishing foreign investment tariffs, it was an endless maze of friction. I spent 40 years eliminating friction on job sites. I despised inefficiency. Camila never asked me to hand over the funds. In fact, she did the exact opposite. She sat on the edge of the bed, crying in apparent frustration over the red tape, and told me we should just give up. She said we should just keep renting, that her clinic wasn't worth the legal headache it was causing me. She offered to walk away from her dream to save me the stress. That was the hook. I was the one who suggested the workaround. I told her we would bypass the system entirely. We would purchase the commercial space and the penthouse directly in her name. To me, it wasn't a massive financial risk. It was an elegant logistical bypass. It made perfect, pragmatic sense. I was using my intelligence to cut through the red tape. I logged into my Vanguard account. I liquidated the core of my life's work. I wired $290,000 into a local corporate account she had set up for the property acquisitions. I didn't hesitate. Watching that confirmation screen load, I didn't feel vulnerable. I didn't feel like a man giving away his safety net. I felt powerful. I was building a future. And the absolute brilliance of their operation was what happened next. They didn't just take the money and vanish. They anchored the illusion. That weekend, Camilla rented a car and drove us up into the mountains, to Petropolis. We spent 3 days in a beautiful cabin with a fireplace. She was intensely affectionate, radiating this deep, overwhelming relief. I felt like a king. I had rescued her, and in return, she was giving me the kind of warmth and devotion I hadn't felt in years. When we got back to Rio, the validation continued. She didn't take me shopping for clothes or jewelry. She took me to a modern co-working space to meet her architect, a young, serious-looking guy who unrolled actual CAD blueprints on a glass table. For 3 hours, we sat there discussing the structural layout of the clinic. The architect asked for my professional opinion on knocking down a load-bearing wall to expand the physical therapy gym. I pointed out a ventilation issue with the HVAC routing on his plans. He nodded, took out his pen, and made the corrections. He deferred to my expertise. Do you understand what they gave me in that room? For 3 hours, I wasn't a lonely, grieving old man trying to buy his way out of isolation. I was Arthur Pendelton, senior structural engineer. I was respected. I was necessary. Before we left the meeting, Camilla reached into her purse and handed me a heavy set of brass keys. The keys to the penthouse. She smiled, kissed my cheek, and said the previous owners were just finishing some minor painting, and we would move our things in by the end of the month. I carried those keys in my pocket for 2 weeks. I would slide my hand in just to feel the cold metal against my fingers as I walked down the street. It was the physical weight of my new life. It was concrete proof that the cynical expats were wrong, that my calculations were right, and that I had successfully engineered my way out of the dark. The collapse began 2 weeks later. It didn't happen with a sudden shock. It happened with the quiet cessation of a routine. Camilla told me she needed to fly to São Paulo on a Tuesday to sign the final municipal permits for the clinic. She kissed me at the door, promised to call me as soon as she landed, and walked to the elevator. I watched the doors close. I went back inside, poured a cup of coffee, and felt a profound sense of peace. By Thursday morning, her phone was going straight to voicemail. I didn't panic immediately. I reasoned that she was busy, that she was navigating the very bureaucracy we had discussed. I was, after all, a logical man. But by Friday afternoon, my WhatsApp messages stopped delivering. The single gray checkmark sat there on the screen, mocking me. On Saturday, the silence in the Leblon apartment became unbearable. The air felt thin. I took a taxi to the commercial address where we were building the clinic. I just wanted to see the space again, to anchor myself in the reality of what we were creating. When the taxi pulled up to the address, there was no construction tape, there were no contractor vans. The space was occupied by a functioning bakery. I walked inside, my chest tightening with every step, and asked the woman behind the counter how long they had been there. 5 years, she told me, wiping down the display case. My hands started to shake. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the heavy brass keys Camilla had given me, the physical weight of my new life. I walked out of the bakery and hailed another taxi to the residential building where our penthouse was supposed to be. I walked past the polished marble lobby and handed the keys to the doorman. I asked him if the painters were finished in my unit. He looked at the keys, confused, and told me they didn't belong to any locks in his building. They were standard issue for a vacant development across town. He checked the registry. No one named Camilla owned anything there. Nobody had ever heard of her. I didn't scream. I didn't collapse in the lobby. I just walked out into the suffocating Rio heat, stood on the sidewalk, and felt 40 years of engineered pride shatter into dust. The money was gone. $290,000, washed through a web of untraceable local corporate accounts that had been closed the moment the funds cleared. The police report was an exercise in humiliation. The officer who took my statement didn't look at me with sympathy. He looked at me with the tired resignation of a man who sees the same predictable tragedy every week. I was evicted from the luxury rental a month later. I now live in a 10-square-meter room in a periphery neighborhood where the tourists never go. The paint on the ceiling peels off in long, curled strips, and the humidity smells like exhaust fumes and damp concrete. I have exactly $2,000 left in a checking account and a Social Security deposit of $1,400 a month that barely covers my rent, basic food, and the medication for a heart that is rapidly failing under the weight of the stress. The financial ruin is devastating, yes, but the money is just math. What actually destroyed me was the realization of what I had allowed myself to become. I wasn't betrayed because I was generous. I was betrayed because I was arrogant. I wanted to buy back my youth. I wanted to purchase the feeling of being a protector, of being vital and necessary to someone beautiful and young. I used my intelligence to construct an elaborate, logical fortress around my own desperate loneliness. I convinced myself I was the savior, the architect of a new life, completely blind to the fact that I was nothing more than a wealthy, grieving old man walking straight into a slaughterhouse. I will never call my daughter in Seattle. I will not force her to look at what her father has become, to see the pathetic, hollow shell of the man who once paid off mortgages and built high-rises. The shame is absolute. It is the only thing I have left that is truly mine. People think that because you are smart, because you have been successful, you are immune to this kind of destruction. They think scams only happen to the foolish or the naive, but intelligence is just a tool. And when you are starving for a single human touch, when the silence of your own life becomes louder than reason, your intelligence will not save you. It will only help you build a stronger, more convincing lie. I calculated every load, every stress point, every variable for 40 years, but I miscalculated the sheer crushing weight of being alone. And now, I am just waiting for the structure to finally give way.